morning. Good morning. Good morning. I am Tamara Shealey. Good morning. It is a chilly, sunny Saturday morning here in Georgia. And y'all, guess who is in the house today? I'm excited. I'm always excited to have this man once a month, y'all. It's an honor, a privilege. Mr. Reggie. Good morning.
Good morning, Tamara. How you doing?
I am doing wonderful, sir. Thank you. I told you it is like an honor, a privilege for you to join us once a month. Thank you.
It's absolutely an honor and a pleasure for me to be with you and your audience. I love this time that we have together every month, Tamara.
Thank you, Mr. Reggie. Thank you, Mr. We got some folks chiming in already. He said, I stay first. Yes, you do, Universal Mike. You be on it, doggone it. Yeah, so last month when you were here, Mr. Reggie, you said that you were going to dive into this conversation, y'all. If you're not following this broadcast, please do. Please do. If you're seeing me on YouTube, hit that like button, hit that notification button, share this. If you're following me here on half of Facebook, because y'all know I'm still shut down on Facebook, Mr. Reggie, that's a whole nother story.
Facebook police got me last year too.
Oh, look! They say that's a badge of honor.
It is. Believe me, it is.
Oh yeah, they got me locked out. But I can access the universal. I mean, I'm looking at him, Universal Mike. He said, "Welcome, Mr. Reggie."
All right, Mr. Mike.
I can't access the Tamara for Georgia page, so please follow me there. If you follow me seeing me on Twitter, make sure you follow me there, and on where else are we? I think we're somewhere else, but follow me. So Mr. Reggie, you said last month, that you were going to dive into the psychological effects of racism. What's going on in our minds?
Yeah, absolutely.
It's deep. I know that's a deep one. I couldn't wait to have you this month.
Yeah, this is something that's kind of been in my the spaces in my head since a number of years ago when I was in college. I took a class on the psychological effects of racism, and the professor, Dr. Dade, really just kind of introduced me to a world of thinking that I had never been introduced to before. I mean, we talked about stuff that I was just like, I've never heard these conversations before. And that was when I was introduced to Frantz Fanon. And for those people who don't know Frantz Fanon, y'all got to get up to speed. Frantz Fanon was a brother that was born on the island of Martinique, French colonial possession in the Caribbean. And, he ended up going to Paris, going to medical school, became a psychiatrist. His first job after medical school was at a hospital in Algeria. And at that time, the Algerians were fighting to kick the French colonial masters out of the country. It was a brutal war. Over 1 million Algerians were killed by the police and military. And it was a horrible, horrible revolution that they eventually won their independence from France. But when he was there, the hospital he worked in, he had a lot of patients that were dealing with the trauma of being tortured by the police and the military. And then he also had patients who were doing the torturing. So he realizes like these oppressive situations impact people on both sides, the oppressors and the oppressed. And he became famous because he wrote, some really wonderful books. Probably his most famous book is Black Skin, White Mask and The Wretched of the Earth. If you haven't read those books, it's just phenomenal. And so when I was engaged in those conversations, Tamara, I was like, man, there's another way to kind of think about our existence as Black people in America. We oftentimes think about all of the physical things that happen to us, but we don't think about the psychological damage that's done to us, the trauma that we deal with on a daily basis up here that we oftentimes never even mention, and how it plays out in terms of how we see ourselves, how we see other people in our community, and how we treat people in our community. And that's what I really wanted to engage in a conversation with you today about, is that there's a lot of stuff that we do kind of unconsciously that really is a part of us reacting to our situation of living as an oppressed community in this country.
Wow. And say those names of those books again. I want to, and his name is Frantz. Say his name
Frantz Fanon, Frantz, and his last name is Fanon, Frantz Fanon. I mean, This man, brilliant man, died way too young of leukemia, but an absolutely just brilliant. One of his other books is A Dying Colonialism. So he was considered to be like this bad person because he spoke out against the oppression, the colonial oppression, and so they call him a Marxist. All of the things that they love calling people that they don't like, they called him all of those things. But he was really being very real about, listen, this is what oppression does to us. And so his last book he wrote, A Dying Colonialism, really talked about how people of color around the world, in Africa and Asia and Latin America, fighting against European colonialism and winning. And so of course they didn't like to hear that, but he's just an amazing person. And one of the books that we use in the course is my absolute favorite book of all time. It's called Frantz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression. It's a wonderful book. It's one of those books that is rare. It's out of print. It's fairly expensive nowadays. Not as expensive as it was, say, 10 years ago. It was like $800 if you were trying to buy it on Amazon like 10 years ago. Because people were like, Reggie, I want to get that book. And it's like, they go to Amazon. It's like, dude, that book is $800. I'm like, man, I don't know what to tell you. I bought it when it was still cheap for the class I took years ago. So I was able to get in. But that book, written by this brilliant man from Somalia, Hussein A. Bulhan, is the author of this book. And I'm telling you, Tamara, I read this book constantly. I'm always picking it up and got kind of like assessing things that are going on now that this man talked about when he wrote this book many, many years ago. And it's just the most brilliant, really, tool that I have available to me to kind of look at the psychology of what we're dealing with being in an oppressive society. And so, I want to share some of those things that I learned in that class, some of the things I've learned from reading Fanon, from reading the book by Bulhan. It's just a lot of stuff that I think is really valuable for us to kind of take a real look in the mirror at kind of who we are and how we see ourselves.
Yeah, let me speak to that a little bit. So we have I host on Tuesday nights on the Clubhouse app in a room, and that room is titled #White Women for Reparations. And that room, we use it as a study session. So we have, for the last 8 weeks, we have been listening to a book titled They Were Her Property. And there's 2 chapters of this book that it messed me up. Like I couldn't, it took me a while to process the information and process what I heard. So these 2 chapters, one chapter was about wet nursing and how Black women were used to nurse, and they were bought to nurse these white babies. And it was like, or babies, just babies, just that was their job, was to just constantly be milked. And it was something about that, because as a mother, I know for me personally, when I was carrying my particularly my oldest son, I didn't even try with my second, but I tried to nurse with my older son, and I just couldn't produce enough milk to satisfy this kid, and it was painful. And I'm like, I can't do this. So it triggered me in such a way, listening to how women were used specifically to nurse, and that triggered me. And then there was another chapter of the book that talked about how our body, like we were bought, and they were not just, they were like madams, and we were bought, and we were like they used our body for sex slaves, and that triggered me in a way. And I'm like, and I thought about how, and I said this in an interview sometime after I had been listening to it. I had an interview, and I remember saying in the interview, I was saying how it made me think about the correlation between how hypersexual we are as a race and what they did to us. And I even mentioned the fact that I'm one of, we believe there's 15 of us, 15 siblings that 15 children that my father has. We kind of don't know, but the number is 15, right? So I'm number 2. And I think about how even, how we have these large, like my father has so many children, how back when men were like studs, like you were bought to breed and to impregnate women and bear children so that they would have more. So a lot of this stuff is very triggering to me. And when I hear it, so going back to your title today, the psychological effects of racism, or just slavery, or just what's ingrained in us, it still lives with me. And like I said, even those incidents, had me kind of off balance for a little bit, just very recently.
Yeah, yeah. You know, those things are powerful because that is how we today are attached directly to the past, right? We don't think about this string that attaches us to our grandparents and our great grandparents and so on and so forth back many, many generations. A lot of the things that we do, a lot of things that are common in our community are a direct correlation to us reacting to the world that we lived in, right? And so, you know, another just brilliant person who's written about this is Dr. Joyce DeGruy, post-traumatic slave syndrome. I mean, this woman is just a phenomenal, phenomenal scholar. In her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, which she wrote, I don't know, 15, 20 years ago, maybe, is a very, very popular book still to this day. She's still on a lecture tour around the country. She's still, you know, teaching out in California. And she came and spoke at a place in northern Illinois, just north of Chicago, 2 years ago. And my wife and a couple good friends of mine, we went down there to hear her, and I met her, and just was really just overjoyed to meet this woman. I had admired her work, her scholarship for so long. She's such a down-to-earth person, but she talks about stuff in a way that really relates to the experiences of people in our community, particularly. Like, she talks about, like, you don't know this because nobody told you this. And that's part of what I kind of take is the way I do my work. It's like there's so much about us that we don't understand because nobody told us those stories. So one of the things that I want to kind of, you know, dig into is like thinking about, and I want everybody in the audience to just do this mental exercise of just thinking about how we are seen in this country, right? In terms of thinking about all the different words that have been used to describe our people in this community, right?
Mm-hmm.
You know, I tell people on my birth certificate, I was born in a little segregated town in Mississippi back in 1965. And my birth certificate doesn't say black. It doesn't say Negro. It doesn't say African American. It says colored. That's literally on my birth certificate, right? So think about all of the different terms that people have used to describe us, the terms we've used to describe ourselves. And there is no other group anywhere on the planet that has had so many different words used to describe who they are as a group. And I don't think that we think about that, right? I was watching this documentary recently where this professor Paulie Murray was just if you guys don't know who Paulie Murray is, that's another like giant. This was a woman. There's a documentary on, I can't remember which one of the networks it's on right now, a documentary about Paulie Murray. This woman is probably one of the most incredible human beings that's ever lived in this country that you've never heard of. This woman really was a groundbreaker in so many different ways. She was a lawyer. She was a poet. She was a professor. She ended up being a priest. I mean, she did some wonderful stuff, but she was a groundbreaking person because she thought way ahead of her time. And she came up with ideas and proposed them to people, and they used it and never gave her public credit for it. For instance, the Brown versus Board of Education decision in 1954, she proposed to the NAACP to do that 10 years before they did it. 10 years before they used that particular argument, she told them this is the argument you should use. They didn't use it. They laughed at her, but then 10 years later, you're like, oh, wrote her a letter. Oh man, that idea you came up with was brilliant and we used it, but nobody knows that publicly. But I want, hopefully everybody had a chance to kind of think of some of those terms, right? The things that we've been called and the things that we accept, right? And listen, it would take 3 episodes to even have a conversation about the N-word, right? Because I detest hearing that word coming out of anybody's mouth. And listen, I'm not trying to tell anybody what to say or what terms to use. People say whatever they want to say. But for me personally, every time I hear that word, it doesn't matter who says it, that word hurts my heart because to me, I feel like it's a word that's been imposed upon us that, we now say that we've taken that and we've turned it into something different. But I hear way too many of us consistently use that word in the same way that white people use it when we get angry with other black people. So we say we use it as a term of endearment. Okay, maybe sometimes you do. But in a lot of cases, you get mad at a brother or sister and you call them that word out of anger the same way. And I've been called the N-word 2 times in my life by white people that I can remember. I want to tell you about both instances. Once, this is back in maybe the early 2000s, late 1990s. I was in the car with a buddy of mine. driving, and it was an ice storm. So the streets are very slippery here in Milwaukee. And we had stopped at a red light, and a car banged into the back of my car and pushed us out into the intersection. So of course, like, oh, this person wasn't paying attention. So, we pulled over, and, we're trying to talk to this white woman about, you ran into my car, and she exchanged information, insurance information, all that stuff. And then she got mad and started saying it was my fault that she ran into my car. She's like, why did you just stop? And I was like, because it was a red light. What do you want me to do? Right. So then she got mad and she started cursing at us. And then, I was just going to let it go because I looked at my car. It wasn't no damage. I mean, it wasn't even a scratch on my car. I was going to just let it go. But when she tried saying it was my fault, I saw a police van driving past and I flagged them down. I was like, okay, I'm gonna let you talk to them about it and explain to them how you ran into me and it's my fault, right? So then she got mad and she floored her car. But before she floored and took off, she said, "You effing N-word" to me and my friend, and just drove off. And I was just like, wow, lady. And so, talked to the cops. I was like, listen, I don't know what's up with this lady, but she already gave me her insurance information, her name, her address. So here, y'all can go talk to this woman, right? So they called me a couple of weeks ago, said they gave her a ticket. That's the first time I remember a white person calling me the N-word in Milwaukee. But before that, when I was like in my late teens, early 20s, I was in my hometown in Mississippi visiting. And in the center of town, there's a courthouse square. So there's a big circle around the courthouse. And that is an area where a lot of young white people hang out on the weekends. On Fridays and Saturdays, they go up there and they playing their loud music and they drinking and acting crazy and all that other stuff. So I'm walking past on my way back to my grandmother's house, right? And so I'm just minding my own business and walking past these people. I don't say nothing to them. But then all of a sudden they start calling me an N-word. It's like 15, 20 of them jump out of their cars and trucks and literally start chasing me down the street. Now, fortunately for me at that time, I played basketball like almost every day, and I was in exceptional shape. It was no way they was going to catch me. I was like O.J. Simpson running through the airport. That's how fast I was running, getting away from these crazy people. But that was one of those things where it's like when someone says that to you, it registers and it doesn't leave your mind ever. So when I hear the word, and it doesn't matter who says it, it always resonates the same with me. And like I said, I don't try to tell people they shouldn't say the word or whatever. I get it. I understand all that. But it's a part of what we have been ingrained to see ourselves as. We've been ingrained to see ourselves. People used to tell me all the time that word has nothing to do with race, right? It's not about the color of your skin or anything, the race you belong to. They said it just means an ignorant person. That's what people used to always say. So I'm like, okay, let me go to the library. And I went to the public library in Milwaukee, Central Library, and I told the person there, I said, I want you to give me every dictionary you have going back as far as you have dictionaries going back, because I have a word I want to look up in the dictionary, right? So they spent like an hour and a half looking for these old dusty dictionaries from 1968 and 1932 and 1880 and 1820. I think the oldest one they had was like 1790 or something, right? They brought out this cart with all these old dictionaries, and I looked up the word Negro or any version of the word Negro in the dictionary. And I ended up, doing a presentation talking about it. I was like, this is how this word has always been a word that means people of African descent. That's how it's always been defined in every dictionary going back to the 1700s. So the fact that we try to say that that's not what it is, listen, that if that makes you feel better, that's fine. But in the real world, if you think that that's what the word means, then you're deluding yourself, because if it meant something different, then you as a black person will never get mad if a white person call you that word. If they're just talking about an ignorant person and that's all it means, you wouldn't get angry at a white person for saying it than you would at a black person for saying it. So I just think that that's something that we need to have a deep conversation about among ourselves, because what it does is it reinforces in us somehow that we're different. We are the only group of people in this country, Tamara, think about this. The only group of people in this country whose race is defined by the color of their skin when they first get here. We were described as Negroes. The first Africans arrived in 1619 were described as 20 or so Negroes. And Negro simply is the word black in Spanish, right? So, the Spanish call us Negros, the English call us Negroes. And that was a term. But white people didn't call themselves white back then, Tamira. White people referred to themselves as, as English But primarily the term that they use to describe themselves, you go back and you look at the records of the early colonies, you will always consistently see that white people refer to themselves as Christians. That was the term they used to describe themselves. They didn't call themselves, anything other than that for really like the first 100 years of American history. So when we think about the terms that we've been called and different versions of Negro, whatever, over the course of time, that word is the most explicit racial epithet in the human language, right? And so we have to think differently about when we say that word, what does that say about how we feel about ourselves? And I understand, younger people constantly tell me, and I listen, like Reggie, we reinvented that word and made it something different so it's not as harmful. And I get that. And I listen, if that's what helps you, wonderful. But you're going to catch yourself using it in an angry way, the same way white people use it. So just be cognizant of that. And the other thing that I really wanted to talk about that it's just very touching to me personally, there's a program I do where I talk about racism as trauma, right? And I use an excerpt from a video called Dark Girls. I don't know if you've ever seen the documentary before, Tamara. If you haven't, look it up. You can find it, at least excerpts from it on YouTube. It's a powerful documentary, and what it talks about is how colorism is a part of our lives as Black people, right? They talk about it starts with this young girl. She's there with her mom, and they're interviewing her, and she says, "I don't like being called Black." Right, this very dark-skinned girl. "I don't like being called Black." And then, the reporter asks, "Well, why not?" She says, "Because I'm not Black." And so they get into the whole conversation about how, within our community, we value lighter skin versus darker skin, right? We put more value in it because white people have put more value on lighter skin than darker skin. And so one of the more poignant moments in that documentary, one that really just, makes me almost want to cry every time I think about it, is this Black woman, and she's describing her best friend having a baby, right? So she said, she had this baby and it was her first child, and she invited me to come over to see the baby. I went over and the baby was this beautiful baby, and I was like, oh my goodness, it's so adorable and all this, right? And then she says, her friend said this. She said, "Girl, I'm so happy he didn't turn out dark." Now, this is a dark-skinned woman hearing her friend say that she's happy her baby didn't turn out dark. And she says it was like a dagger in her heart to hear her friend say that, because she's been dealing with, that issue of being dark-skinned her entire life and how harmful it's been. And so, they talked about the brown paper bag test, like in our community. If you were lighter than the brown paper bag, then you were acceptable. If you were darker, then you weren't acceptable. The whole idea of, good hair versus bad hair, pretty eyes versus not pretty eyes, all of those things. It's like, those are ideas that have been imposed upon us over generations and generations, over 400 years. And we have internalized those things. That's called internalized oppression. One of the terms that Frantz Fanon and the Psychology of Oppression book uses is what they call auto-oppressors. So you live in an oppressive society and you're oppressed from the outside by the oppressors constantly over the course of time. And eventually you start to turn that in to oppressing yourself. So you become the people that criticize yourself, and the oppressors don't have to do it anymore. You do the work for them. And, it becomes internalized in terms of you not thinking positively of yourself. So what you start to do is you react to your oppression by doing negative things to yourself. You can't deal with the pressure, the trauma, all of that. So you become a person who becomes addicted to alcohol or some type of drug in order to help you deal with the reality that you don't feel good about who you are, because society has told you that you're worthless, that you're, inferior, that you're all of these negative things, whether you are or not. Society tells you that, and you get consistent reinforcement of it all the time. And so for us in our community, this is something we've been dealing with for so long that we've gotten to the point where we don't even talk about it anymore. Malcolm X gave a speech years ago, and one of the things he said in that speech was, he said, "Who taught you to hate yourself? Who taught you to hate the shape of your nose, the size of your lips, the color of your skin?" He says, "Who taught you that?" He says, "A white man did." American society has taught us that if our lips are too thick, then there's something wrong with us, right? If our nose is too broad, there's something wrong with us. That we're not beautiful unless we're light skinned, right? And so when you think about, the images that American, the beauty society of America teaches us what's beautiful. For many years it's been a light skinned black woman, right? You couldn't be beautiful if you were a dark skinned black woman, but if you were light skinned, then somehow you were beautiful because you were closely approximated with white women. And this is one of the things that's very interesting for me. And I'd say this to people, like, if you were to really honestly understand the history of your family, and almost all of our families, this is part, if our families came here during the time, those 246 years our families were enslaved in this country, somewhere along the way, somebody in your family was raped. They may have been a grown woman when they were raped. They may have been a 12, 13, 14-year-old girl, 10-year-old girl when they were raped. And they may have had a child. And so when they had those children, America came up with a new way of describing those children. They call them a mulatto. So if you have a black parent and a white parent, you were considered to be a mulatto. And they use mulatto because that was associated with the word mule. And one of the interesting things about a mule, people don't know this, a donkey and a horse have a baby together. It's a mule, right? Well, a mule cannot have children. A mule cannot, get with another mule and have a child. It doesn't work. So they considered mulatto children. They said that they're sterile. They'll never be able to have children. So they felt that mulattoes, because there were so many so-called mulattoes in our community, that we would die off, that we would be extinct. When slavery ended, after the Civil War, there were books, articles, opinion pieces written about us that said we're going to die off by 1900. We would cease to exist in this country. And part of it was that they said we're mulattoes. And then if you had one of your grandparents was white and three were black, then you were a quadroon. If one of your great grandparents was black and the other, 7 were white, then you were an octoroon, and so on. So there's had all these different terms. Nobody else has had all of those different gradations. So when we think about how we're described now as black, African American, whatever term people use, it's not based on our skin color or our so-called race, because race isn't even real. Race is a social construct that allowed white people who were enslaving blacks and Native Americans to justify their enslavement and mistreatment of us by saying that we were a different species of humanity than they were. But think about this, Tamara. And people always talk about the one-drop rule. But first of all, there was never a one-drop rule, right? Every state had their own definition of race. And when you look, and I looked this up, you could literally be black in one state by definition and walk across the state border and be in another state and not be black. You could leave Georgia and go to Alabama and be a different race because they define what black was in a different way, right? So the idea of us being black, I always say it's a joke because, listen, Barack Obama's dad was black, his mom was white, but he was the first black president. Why couldn't he have been, another in the long line of white presidents? Because one of his parents was white, but no, he's black. So, if you have any so-called blackness in you, all of a sudden you're black. But these are the same people that tell us that from that perspective, our blood is superior because we're going to be black. If a black and white person get together, they tell us we're superior in that space, but then they say we're inferior in everything else. So how can you have it both ways? You can't say that we're inferior to white people in intellect and morals and all this other stuff, but when we hook up and have a child together, that the child is automatically going to be black, right? And so I always say that the way we define ourselves, the way we accept people's definition of us is very flawed. And I don't have a problem with people using, the terms of when you describe race. I don't have a problem with it because I know it's not real biologically, but socially it is. And when it becomes problematic, calling somebody black or white or Asian, Hispanic, whatever, it's not problematic unless you use this idea that's been around in America for 200 years, racial hierarchy, where there's a hierarchy of races, where white people from Northwestern Europe always being at the top. And then the second ledger on that hierarchy are white people from Southern and Eastern Europe. And then it just goes down. And black people are always at the bottom, right? They're always at the bottom. And it's been this way for all of American history since they started defining race in this way. So when I think about the way that we have internalized those ideas, we've accepted those ideas, that's part of the reason that we have so much difficulty interacting with each other. When I was a teacher, I taught middle school for 8 years, middle and high school for 8 years. And one of the things that used to stress me out on a regular basis was the girls that I taught. Every school I taught in was all black school, no white students. Other than one school, I had one white student, but all schools I taught in were all black schools, right? And the black girls that I had, I was one of those teachers that tried to develop relationships with my students to get to know them better, have them get to know me so that I could coax them into doing, the best that they could do in class. When students trust you, then they're going to work harder for you than if they just feel like you're just some fake teacher that's collecting a check, right? So I always try to develop those relationships. And as a result of that, when students had problems, they would come to me and say, Mr. Jackson, I need to talk to you about something, right? So I would hear all of these stories from these girls. And a lot of times the stories I heard, Tamara, were that they would say something like this: Mr. Jackson, they've been talking about me on Facebook or Instagram or something. They've been teasing me about, how dark I am. They're calling me a monkey. They're calling me all these different negative things. It's like, how do I tell this beautiful black child that she's beautiful, regardless of what people say about her, right? How do I help her to raise her self-esteem, to understand that being dark doesn't mean there's something wrong with you? Because I always say that if you're a person who brags about your light skin, then and if you one of these people in our community, we hear this all the time, that claim they got Indian ancestors, right? Okay, prove to me that you have Indian ancestors. Just because you got somebody in your family has some straight hair back in the day, don't mean there was an Indian. It may have been some Irish dude that raped your great grandmother, is why you got their hair. But I wanted these girls, when I talked to them, to understand and listen. You can't allow, and I used to say this to my students all the time, don't allow anyone else's opinion of you to be more important than your opinion of yourself. Because if you do, people are going to drag you down into an area where you have no confidence in yourself. And that's all part of this idea of colorism and, good hair versus bad hair. What I used to joke when I would give tours at America's Black Holocaust Museum about bad hair. I said, listen, nobody has bad hair. The only way your hair can be bad is if it jumps off of your head and jumps on somebody and scratches their face up or beats them up. Then I'll say, yeah, you got some bad hair. Your hair is bad. But other than that, it's just the texture of your hair. It's the way we were born. Our genes say that that's what our hair is going to be like. And if your hair isn't like that, it's probably more than likely 85% of us, according to genealogists, at least 85% of Black people in America have at least one white ancestor somewhere in their family. So when we talk about how we look and how we treat each other, and for years, we've been horrible to each other. And part of that is like, we don't value being Black because we don't value what Black represents in our society. That famous scene in Spike Lee's Malcolm X, where he's looking through the dictionary and looking up the word Black and all the manifestations of the word Black, blackmail, black cloud over you, all that other stuff. And then he looks up white and it's like everything beautiful about white, right? That is manifested in the way we see ourselves. And it's hard for us to understand that, or even to admit that that's a part of how we see ourselves. And I always want people to understand very clearly, like, listen, you're a product of all of your ancestors who came before you. You have to understand that all of the things that happened to them have been passed on generationally. Because when you're a young child, you may be in the room and you may hear your parents or grandparents talking about something bad that happened to them. They're not talking to you necessarily, but they're talking about that horrible experience of, when my granddad was lynched or something like that. Or, when my father went to get a job and they beat him up and told him they weren't going to hire any Black person, stuff like that. You hear those things. It's passed on from generation, and it impacts the way we see ourselves. So what happens in our lives is we become auto-oppressors. And one of the main ways that you become an auto-oppressor is to turn the violence from society against those in your community. It's called displaced aggression. Everybody's done this at some point. They've gotten mad at somebody about something, Tamara, and like, let's just say you at work, right? And you make a mistake at work, or your boss thinks you make a mistake, and your boss yells at you, right? You want to say something to your boss like, hey, man, but you can't because you need that job. You're not going to say anything. You keep it inside of your head, right? But then you go home and you yell at your wife, you yell at your kids, You kick the dog to the other side of the room. You're taking that anger out, that aggression out on a safer, more convenient target. So we think about what white people love to call black on black crime, which is just crime, because nobody ever uses the term white on white crime. I always tell white people, and they're like, well, what do you think about black on black crime? I say the same thing I think about white on white crime. It's crime. So why you got to call it black on black crime, but you never call it white on white crime? I mean, I can do a whole show on that too. But I say that to say this. A lot of what we see in our community, when you get past the statistics, right? The number of black people that kill black people and all that other stuff. Okay, the data is pretty clear. But what's not clear is the reasons why. And when you look into the reasons why, Milwaukee has a homicide commission that does a database, and they tell you, everything they know about the homicides that happen in Milwaukee, right? And they'll give you on those few occasions, which is like less than half, where they actually find the person that committed the murder, they'll tell you the reasons why that murder took place. So a lot of times it comes from an argument somebody had, a disagreement over money, an argument, somewhere. A lot of times it comes from just normal interactions. And almost every time, like 7 out of 10 times, alcohol is involved in murders in Milwaukee. So the person who was murdered or the person who murdered them, alcohol was involved. And we know what happens when people drink. They become uninhibited. So they say things they wouldn't say. They do things they wouldn't do. So that anger at society, we're mad at society. Like, I know it's a lot of black people today that's mad about the results of the trial in Kenosha, Wisconsin, with Kyle Rittenhouse. People been, reaching out to me on Facebook. Reggie, you must be mad about something. I'm not mad about it. Why would I be mad about it? I expected that outcome. If I expected a different outcome, maybe I would be mad, but I expect that outcome. But when you look at society, how we've been treated, how we continue to be treated, as a black person, there's a lot of anger inside of us that we don't necessarily acknowledge. And a lot of times, Tamara, we get to that point where we need a safe, convenient target to let that anger out. And that safe, convenient target is somebody in our community, somebody close to us, a family member, a friend, And in a lot of cases, people are killed by people that they know. It's not like on TV where some random stranger is killing all these people. Most people in this country, in the cases where they know who did the murder, they had a relationship in some way with the person who murdered them. So a big part of that is that displaced aggression we have in our community. And you see it throughout, the diaspora of black people. When you study South Africa during apartheid, you had the same rates of murder in the black community in South Africa that you had here. You had the same rates of alcoholism, drug abuse, domestic violence, all of those things that we see here that are a negative part of how we interact with each other. You saw the same thing in South Africa during apartheid, because the same mechanism is playing out. That displaced aggression, that displaced anger, we become auto oppressors and we strike out against people in our own community. It's not like we do it intentionally, but that's just a function of being in an oppressed community. You look at oppressed communities throughout the history of the world, and you find very, very similar things happen in all of those communities. They begin to strike out at each other. And that's part of what I wanted to say about how we see each other, thinking about taking a second to think before we say certain things to each other, right? Before we do certain things to each other, just to think like, why am I doing this? Am I really mad at this person, or I'm just really upset that Jacob Blake got shot in the back 8 times in Kenosha? They had riots in Kenosha as a result of, because people were very, very angry that nothing happened to the cop. And then this Kyle Rittenhouse shoots and kills 2 people, injures another person, and then he gets off scot-free. How could you not be in as a resident of Kenosha? And I know plenty of people live in Kenosha. It's about 40 miles south of Milwaukee. People are very incensed about what was going on in terms of how the trial was playing out, and of course with the verdict. So those things are things that you see kind of flowing out of us when we talk about the so-called riots in Milwaukee in 1916, the so-called riots in Detroit 1967, Watson 1965, LA 1992. What all of those had in common, Tamara, was this: Black people were angry about a lot of stuff. But the straw that broke the camel's back was police activity, the kind of activity we expect from the police in terms of mistreatment. That was the final straw. But when you look deeply into it, I lived in LA during the whole Rodney King affair. When Rodney King, when the video came out, I saw it on the news that night, right? And all of the stuff leading up to it. And I understood when the rage came out, when those officers were found not guilty, I understood why people poured out their rage. You know, they beat Reginald Denny, this white truck driver. That was the rage that was in their body. It's like they're mad at society, but they can't do anything to society. So they find a safe, convenient target. And oftentimes that target is our own people.
Mr. Reggie, that was so much. You're right. It would take several broadcasts and several hours to unpack just portions of that. I'll just tell you, I hosted a room this past Thursday, another room in the Clubhouse app, and when I tell you the anger that lives inside of us, I know it. There was a white woman, and this room is called Hard Conversations, White Women, Black Women, Let's Talk. And there was a white woman who was Muslim. So there was some cultural differences there, as well as the racial difference. And she just got something really wrong with whatever she was saying. She just got it. She was just wrong. And when I tell you how angry the Black people and the Black women specifically in that space had gotten, I didn't know how to. It was kind of like out of control, because we are so angry, and that rage is just so deep rooted and so embedded in us from so many other things. And it's like, when it comes up, we will take your head off. It's like, so it's like, how do we as a people, and I know that probably becomes a whole nother broadcast, like just how do we process this anger? And what I was probably, when I saw the room on Clubhouse blow up and I saw us get so angry, and like I said, that is just anger from everywhere. Like you say, there's so many things we can do nothing about. So when we have that opportunity to say something and do something, it is like, woo, you better get out of our way.
Oh yeah.
So I don't know where we even start. So in that moment, I tried to like ask everybody just to be mindful of their tone. Let's be mindful of the way we approach this. Like, I wanted to kind of bring the temperature down. I don't even know where we start with trying to. I think it's so much hurt and so much that needs to heal inside of us from the trauma, that for everything that's been done to us. We have these scars that are not more than scars. We have wounds that are still bleeding. Like, we're still bleeding on the inside from what has been done to us. Like I say, going back to the top of the hour when I was telling you about listening to that chapter about wet nursing in that book that we were listening to how we were literally like sex slaves, and it was prostitution. Like, y'all were the first ones to pimp us out. Like, this is what y'all did to us. And now you wonder why we, as a people, as a race of people, everything is so, again, hypersexual. Like, everything is sexualized. So all the things that have been done to us, I don't even know, Mr. Reggie, bringing it full circle, where do we start to heal?
Well, one of the interesting things about kind of these discussions of trauma, right? Trauma informed care has been, something that's been talked about a lot in the last really 20 years. So, people dealing with people who are dealing with some type of trauma. And so there's a couple different ways that it's been addressed. So there's a survey that people who do trauma-informed care use, and it's called the ACEs survey, Adverse Childhood Experiences. So they ask you a series of questions. It's like 10 questions, and they ask you about things that have happened to you during your childhood inside of your home. So they'll ask you something like, have you ever, during the time you've been living in your home, had a family member or an adult in that home physically abuse you or sexually abuse you, right? Or they ask, have you witnessed, someone being physically or sexually abused in your home? So they ask you all these questions. And generally, when Black people fill this out, they get a much higher score than white people get, right? And so my business partner and I, we looked at that and we started becoming involved in kind of some of the trauma informed spaces in Milwaukee, doing work with some organizations that do training on trauma and how to deal with it. So we began to kind of learn a lot about how trauma manifests itself, and then different techniques to kind of mitigate that trauma, right? And so one of the things that we said right away is like, listen, this ACEs survey, these 10 questions you're asking are not adequate questions, because trauma happens outside your home and it happens outside of you being a child. You can be traumatized as an adult. And there's two types of trauma. There's direct trauma and there's indirect trauma. So for instance, if you're driving down the street and there's a horrible car accident and somebody gets, just mangled in this car accident, badly injured, or even dies, and you witness that, that's direct trauma. Now, the trauma, the physical stuff didn't happen to you, but you were there to witness it, right? Or if you're watching television back in 2005 and you're seeing all of the images of what happened in New Orleans during Hurricane Katrina, you're not there in New Orleans. You're not dealing with the flood waters and all that other stuff, but it's traumatizing to you to see that, right? So that's indirect trauma. So the approach that most people in mental health have taken over the course of time is a way that we think is flawed. So what we did is we said, listen, first of all, we created a new survey that we call the identity crisis survey, right? And what it does is we look at things that happen outside your home. So if you're a child, when you leave on your way to school, do you have to deal with, people who are gang members, right? As an adult, have you been traumatized by being pulled over by the police and having them do something horrible to you? So we added a lot of different questions to it. We brought some focus groups together and asked people about some things that they think should be a part of the survey. So we developed this ID-ACEs survey. So anyway, that was one approach. We said that you got to look at it in a broader way. Trauma is a lot more than what we think it is. And it happens outside the home. It happens outside of childhood. And then the second part is the way people have been treating trauma. It goes back to the early years of the creation of the field of psychology here in America and in England, right? And so the giants of psychology, Freud, Jung, all of these different people that we hear about were the creators of psychology. They had a very specific way of treating people with mental health disorders, right? And it generally, they found a way to blame you for it, right? And they generally said that in order for you to get past it, you have to fix yourself. So the fact that your parents did horrible stuff to you as a child, somehow they find a way to blame you for it, and you have to figure out how to take on that blame, and that'll supposedly alleviate it, right? Something of that nature. But what a lot of people from our community, particularly the Black community, have been saying over a number of years is that you make a mistake by asking the wrong question up front. So this is the question that they'll generally ask you when it comes to trauma. They'll ask you this question. And this is, when you think about it, it doesn't make any sense. They'll ask you, what's wrong with you? You go in to see a psychiatrist or whatever, and they say, well, what's wrong with you that you need to talk to me about? Right? They don't necessarily say those words specifically, but that's literally what they're asking. What's wrong with you, right? But Black psychologists and psychiatrists have said that's the wrong question to ask, because it's not building empathy with the person, and you're not getting to the core of what the problem is. And so they say, instead of asking that question, Tamara, the question you should be asking is not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you? What happened to you that caused you to feel this way about this particular thing, right? Because now the person can kind of really get into like, well, during the course of my life, this happened, that happened, these things impacted me. And so that's why I am what I am right now, right? So that approach to trauma is kind of something that's new, that Black people have come in and said, wait a minute, the way, the white folks are talking about trauma and dealing with trauma, and the reason that Black people don't want to go to white professionals who are, helping them with trauma is because they don't get it. They're still asking the wrong questions. And they're trying to tell them, listen, ask the right questions. That's what Frantz Fanon talked about. Ask the right questions. Look at the role that society plays in making you who you are. And then there's a growing field of research that shows when you take that approach, it works much better with Black people than the traditional approach. Because Black people, it's taboo in our community even talk about mental health issues, right? And so you don't want to go to somebody that you don't feel like will understand your experiences. So you don't want to go to some, 27-year-old white woman when you're a 45-year-old Black woman to talk about the challenges you've had in your life. Or you're a 55-year-old Black man, you don't want to go talk to some 24-year-old white dude from, some little rural community in northern Minnesota. He ain't gonna understand what you're talking about. So we have to find a way to bridge that gap and bring Black healthcare professionals into that space so that we can unburden ourselves with these things, because it's a terrible, terrible burden. It causes a great deal of stress. And what stress does physically to us is it causes us to have cortisol running through our veins on a regular basis. Cortisol is a very important chemical in our bodies that when we're faced with something that's an emergency, cortisol starts running to help us make a quick decision. You know, people talk about adrenaline, but cortisol, what it does is it helps you deal with something that's an immediate threat, right? So if there's a car coming across the lane, and your body will automatically, cortisol start running through your brain, and it'll help you to avoid running into that car that's crossed over the lane, right? But what it does, though, is when you're constantly stressed out, like Black people in America are constantly stressed out, cortisol is constantly running through your body. And what it does is it causes high blood pressure. It causes heart disease. It causes diabetes. It causes so many physical ailments that we don't even realize. A lot of the physical problems we have, you know, people always say, well, if you stop eating that pork and you stop eating this, it's not about what we eat. It's about what we experience. We can be the healthiest person in America, but as a Black person, still be stressed out and still deal with things that we wouldn't be dealing with if it wasn't for that high level of stress and the cortisol running through our veins that causes all of these extraneous different physical conditions that are a manifestation of the stress that we deal with as being a Black person. And the maternal mortality rate, Black mothers who die giving birth and within a year of giving birth, is 3 times higher for Black women than it is for white women. People used to think it was related to socioeconomic, you know, things. You know, a lot of poor Black women didn't have medical care, neonatal care, all that other stuff. But when they started to do further studies, they found that the difference between Black and white women was the same, regardless of what socioeconomic group they were in. So when we heard about, you know, Serena Williams nearly dying when she had her first child, you know, the reason she didn't was because she had done some research and realized there was a condition that she had, but the doctors didn't know. She had to tell the doctors. And they did a very interesting study, Tamara, where they said, we want to look at Black women who came to America from West Africa and monitor their maternal mortality rates. And you know what they discovered? The first 2 generations in America, their maternal mortality rate was the same as white women. No change. But by the time you get to that 3rd and 4th generation, you start to see it creeping up higher and higher and higher. And here in the state I live in, Wisconsin, which I call Mississippi on a regular basis for a reason, not only because I was born in Mississippi, raised in Wisconsin, but I call it Mississippi because it's Mississippi. It's northern Mississippi, literally, here in Wisconsin. But we have the highest maternal mortality rate difference between Black and white women. It's 5 times higher in Wisconsin than it is nationally at 3 times higher. So we have the biggest gap between Black and white women, and it's because of the constant stress that we're under. And so that's one of the things we have to deal with. Is we have to understand that a lot of the things we're dealing with are based on stress. We have to find ways of mitigating that stress. We have to find ways to get in that space where we're comfortable talking to people about those very, very personal things that traumatize us. And another thing I think is important is getting into a space with people who have shared experiences. Getting in those groups that can help you talk about, you know, I dealt with this, another person, yeah, I dealt with the same thing, you know, getting in a space where people understand your experience because they had the same or similar experiences is very, very helpful.
Yeah, going back to what you said about, you know, Black people and mental health, it is so frowned upon as if there's something wrong with you because you know, you're dealing with something internally that you can't explain and you recognize that you need help. But if you reach out, I hate the stigma that is in our community that there's something wrong with you. And they trust me, Black people, they don't forget it. Oh, you know, he had to go talk to somebody. You know, she had to go talk to somebody. You know, she ain't all right. Yep. She is all right because she went to talk to somebody. Exactly. He is all right because he went to talk to somebody.
Yeah. And you know, that goes way back to the days of slavery. We were told when we had, you know, physical or mental issues that it was because we were Black, that there's something wrong with you because you're a Black person. When it was a white person, you know, they asked probing questions about, you know, what led up to this. And so for them, it never became nearly as stigmatized, particularly among white people with money. Now, if you were a poor white person and you had that, you know, they would talk about you the same way Black people talk about each other, you know, and if you kind of read some of the stories of how psychology developed over the course of time, and it really was a very elitist, you know, thing. You know, Sigmund Freud, all of his patients were rich people, you know, who lived in the same community he lived in. So he extrapolated the experiences of those rich people who grew up with a you know, silver spoon in their mouth, and he equated the issues they had to the issues of average everyday people, and didn't make any sense because their experience was completely different. But most of the theories that developed in psychology early on were very elitist, and so those things didn't apply to us. So therefore, we never really had access to getting treatment. It's like Dr. Joy says, we had 246 years of trauma dealing with slavery and got no treatment. Then we had 100 years of Jim Crow segregation, lynching, anti-Black race riots, all of that other stuff, no treatment. Continued discrimination against Black people, still no treatment. And somehow people tell us, well, that's just who y'all are. That's part of your culture. And we say it too. Yeah, that's how we are. That's what we do. No, it isn't. That's what you think you are, because that's what America has taught you about yourself. You have to get outside of that mindset of seeing yourself through someone else's lens. Look at it from the lens of people like you and ask yourself. And I always say to people, the work that I do, Tamara, I do this to honor my family, my ancestors that have dealt with this garbage their entire lives. My mother, her experiences growing up in Mississippi. I just talked to her the other day, and she was telling me, she only has 2 uncles that are still living. And she talked to the oldest one just, last week. And he was telling her about how hard it was for him growing up as a kid in Mississippi and how he felt about white people as a result of how they treated Black people. Those things are things that we need to kind of come to grips with and understand that it's not our fault. We can't blame ourselves for this trauma that people have created in terms of not giving us the same opportunities to have advancements in America that white people have been given. And, I always say this to white people, like, listen, y'all have taught yourselves that y'all have what y'all have because of the Protestant work ethic. And you ignore all of the programs that the federal government created specifically to help y'all. What this one author calls, affirmative action for white people. The Homestead Act. Take the land from the Indians, give it to white people for next to nothing, right? Federal Housing Administration, we'll give you white people loans to get a house and a business. We won't give Black people a loan to get a house or business. GI Bill. Oh, yeah, we'll give the GI Bill benefits for free college and, business money, open a business, buy a house. We'll get it to the white GIs, but most of the Black GIs, you're not going to get it, right? So they've been constantly giving handouts. What they call handouts is different than what we call handouts, right? They call welfare handout. And I'm like, listen, dude. The things that your grandparents got, the GI Bill, the FHA loans, that was a handout too. You just don't want to call it that. Y'all had affirmative action. Y'all just didn't call it affirmative action. And instead of us telling white people the truth about why they are so far ahead of us, we try to act like, yeah, well, we just do what white people do. Well, it doesn't work like that in the real world.
Mr. Reggie Jackson, it is always a pleasure. It is always an honor to have you, sir. You bring the fire. This audience loves you. Y'all, Mr. Reggie is working on some big stuff to come. I'm sure he'll come back and tell us all about it, where to find him and what he's doing. I'm excited. This man is a wealth of knowledge, and we just appreciate you, sir, for lending us your time and being a part of our world and sharing this great information, because a lot of this stuff we don't know. I always say we have pieces of the puzzle, but when we start to come together, it all starts to make a whole lot of damn sense. So I thank you, sir, for joining us.
I appreciate the opportunity. And when I come on next time, remind me to tell you my story of the puzzle box.
Puzzle box. Y'all get ready for that, y'all. The puzzle box. We have to hear his story next month. The puzzle box, y'all. Get ready. Get ready. Thank you, Mr. Reggie.
All right.
Have a good one. Thank you. I'm going to put you in the audience for just a moment. All right, y'all. Mr. Reggie Jackson. He brings it. He brings the fire every single time he comes. That's right, Universal Mike. We love Mr. Reggie Jackson, boy. Good stuff. Good stuff. So I am Tamara Shealey, everybody. I give voice every week right here, giving voice to issues, activists, and activism. Please support this broadcast. This is independent media at its finest, y'all. We got to tell our own stories. These are our own truths. Traditional media will never cover it. They will never give us this opportunity. So we have to be our own voices. So please support this broadcast. Go to the website, tamarashealey.com. Make a donation. I am running for the U.S. Senate. If you don't know, now you know. I'm running for the U.S. Senate. Tamara for Georgia. Go to the website. Taking a bold agenda to Washington. You know that I'm a reparationist, hands down, y'all. Bold agenda, bold Black agenda. They're going to have to cut that check, and they're going to have to get it right with those of us who are descendants of chattel slavery in this country. You know, I work alongside churches in the reparations movement. Reparations Sunday, y'all. Reparationssunday.com. Go to the website. You're looking for a church home, or if you're a pastor and you want to join us in this crusade, Reparations Sunday. Share this with your pastors. If you're looking for a church home, looking for pastors that do preach this word, Reparationssunday.com. Go to the website. You can also find me at hb541.net. That's the bill here in Georgia to study the impact of slavery on those of us who are descendants of chattel slavery right here in the state of Georgia. hb541.net, y'all. They just finished redistricting here in Georgia. Y'all know I heard about it. I got to go see these maps. I heard they done sliced and diced and moved all of us around. So there's some stuff going on here in Georgia. But HB541 is the study to study the impact of slavery right here in the great state of Georgia. Keeping up with Congress, y'all. We got through 1,000 bills in the U.S. House. We got through 1,000 bills in the United States Senate. We were on Facebook, Clubhouse, Twitter, YouTube, and the Wisdom app. We were able, from January until this past Thursday, we got through 1,000 bills in the U.S. House and the U.S. Senate. That was preparation for our reparations, y'all. Let me say that again. That was preparation for our reparations. So we needed to know the lay of the land. We needed to know who these legislators, who they are, where their sweet spots, because a lot of them champion a lot of bills, and we needed to see like what is it, how are they moving? And now we got a lay of the land. We are ready to take our fight to Washington, y'all. So that was keeping up with Congress. We are finished. That was our homework. We did it. Facebook, Clubhouse, Twitter, YouTube, Wisdom. Thank you. It's all there, y'all. You can find me on the Clubhouse app every Tuesday. I'm busy. I ain't playing. Every Tuesday, White Women for Reparations. Hashtag White Women for Reparations. We just got finished with They Were Her Property. We're moving into our next book this coming Tuesday. Join us. Hashtag White Women for Reparations. Bring white women to the space. They got to hear this for themselves. The book we're getting ready to listen to is The History of Whiteness, y'all. So that'll be quite interesting this coming Tuesday. You can also find me on Thursdays on the Clubhouse app. Hard Conversations, White Women, Black Women, Let's Talk. When I tell you these conversations get heated, they get heated. Now, you know, we're moving into the campaigns, the holiday season. We're constantly campaigning, but we're moving into the holiday season, y'all. Campaign swag is on the website. Go get your campaign swag. As you start to spend these holiday dollars, make sure you spend it on the campaign so that we can take our rightful place inside the U.S. Senate. Holiday shopping, y'all, polishing politics. So on the fundraiser page of the Tamara for Georgia website, click and support. So I will see you back here on next week, Saturday, Tamara for Georgia, y'all.
When we come to Washington in this campaign, we're coming to get our check. Young prodigies. Grow. Free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud, 1, 2, mic check. Cream, cash rules everything around me. Dream, my legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, HR40 and our paper.
Kicking the door, coming for our 40 acres and more. Our 6.4 trillion. Miss that no, we fought the Civil War.
We came from the poor.
Start from the bottom, we still on the floor. We pray to the Lord.
Amen.
Picking the cotton, our fingers are sore.
Straight out the underground, escaping from slavery. The only cemeteries that we had were the trees. Watching our bodies while they blew in the breeze. Thinking to the north side to get free.
That way came from slavery. Where's on the mirror once you say owes me? Put her head on the door, but the werewolf schemes. Stick to the north side to get free.
Reparations, Martin said we coming for our check. Reparations, say it loud, 1, 2, mic check. Cream, cash rules everything around me. Dream, my legacy, you can't stop me. Coming for our 40 acres, HR40 and our paper.
We taking them back. Putting Pettis Bridge on the map. Police came with the strap. That Sunday was bloody, no cap.
Stop capping.
Speaking of cap, Kaepernick taking knees at the flag. Where my justice at? We built this nation, better give me them racks. All fat, just a match and a little bit of gasoline. 4 girls got bombed back in '63.
400 years, yeah, we still
shoes, tryna pull up bootstraps. Increasing the gap. Wealth got bigger, so we had to adapt. Discriminated cause we black. I know it worth more than I know it's a fact. They tryna feel scraps. Strike me on board so we can't come back.
30 years ago on April 19, Yusef and Try Remy Chemical Reed.
If it happened to them, think it happened to me. Screaming out ready